My name is Joanna Dueweke-Perez. I work in community economic development in Detroit, and I currently work at Techtown Detroit. I forgot about where I am now. Okay. And this, as if you couldn't tell from that moment right there, is our first time telling this portion of our story in such a public way.
Yes. My name is Chanell Contreras. I'm the director of Prosperous Detroit, where I have the privilege of serving entrepreneurs of color in particular, in Detroit's neighborhoods. Now, before we get started, Joanna and I want to acknowledge and claim our vulnerability right now. We are telling a story that is deeply personal, but as I'm sure most of you know, what's personal is social and political, and so we're sharing this story with hopes that you can see yourselves in our story and also take something from it, take something with it, or something. Sorry. Take something from it that's valuable to you.
Oh, go back. Sorry. Okay. So to start our story, I'm going to start with my boss at Prosperous Detroit decided to move on. And I had only been there for about 5 months, so it was kind of jarring. In the decision to actually take that job was because I wanted to work for that woman. And then I felt like I chose that job because I was ready to learn from someone that I thought could make me a better contributor to my version of social justice. But little did I know, this chapter in my professional journey would have an incredible impact on me that went further than just choosing a boss that might be good for me. But before we get too far, let's define some of the terms we'll be talking about and explain the organization of Prosperous Detroit, which is the context of our story. We will be working with terms like white supremacy, inclusion, racism, whiteness, and identity. So for us, white supremacy is the definition of whites as the norm or standard for human, and people of color is an inherent deviation from that norm.
Yes, and we'll talk about inclusion, which is the act of including or being included in a group or structure with a particular emphasis on valuing different identities. Those identities could be along race, religion, gender, sexuality, size, ability, and probably so many more.
Yeah, and for us, one of those is also whiteness, which is the idea of defining white folks as a specific social class.
Yes, and of course, we'll talk a little bit about racism. Which is the use of prejudices and biases and acting on those within structures and systems that retain power for white people.
Yeah.
Scared yet?
Next slide, thanks. So now that we're done level setting a little bit, let's get back to our story. So Prosperous, as has been said a couple different times, is an organization that supports aspiring and existing neighborhood entrepreneurs in the city of Detroit through entrepreneurial training, technical services, and microlending. When I applied for this job and I got it, I was the program manager, and I saw this as everything I wanted to be in the world. I saw myself as compassionate, interested in working on solutions towards the racial wealth gap, and committed to the city of Detroit. But as you know, my boss left, and so the search for a director started, and I had to kind of step up because I was the next person in line. So not only was I running the training program, which I was hired to do, but I was planning large events, I was supervising team members and interns, I was writing grants and meeting with stakeholders, I was running weekly team meetings, and I was coordinating with executive leadership.
Now, meanwhile, I had just moved back to Detroit after a few great years in Atlanta, where I was mostly family-focused. Had my young daughter, my husband. We had a great time. And at the time, I was spending about 20% of my time focused on consulting for community economic development initiatives. That worked for a while until it didn't anymore. And I moved back to Detroit with the sense of urgency around finding my place. Not only was I looking for stability, but also community and a sense of purpose, to do something bigger than myself. So one day I heard about the opening at Prosperous, and it was exactly what I wanted to do. Serving Black, Latino, and Arab entrepreneurs felt like this is something I can commit myself to, and I think I'd be a good fit for it. So I applied and moved through the hiring process, and obviously they hired me.
So, as you might imagine, hiring your boss is a really hard thing to do. I was spending a lot of time reflecting on my own career, my own qualifications, and ideas about what I wanted to do with my future. There were lots of folks in the ecosystem encouraging me to apply, but there was something that was holding me back. I had these assumptions about the kind of candidate the hiring team would be looking for, and I didn't see someone that looked like me as the person they were interested in for this role. So I never said this to leadership, right? But this was something that I was carrying with me. My own stuff aside, we hired Chanell, and I wasn't super enthusiastic about it. I cared deeply about Prosperous, so I knew that the next step was preparing for this person. And so I knew that I needed to make space for her on our team. So I wasn't quite sure that Chanell was what or who the organization needed, but I did know that there were certain things that needed to happen. So I created presentations, I planned for her first week of meetings, I chose her email address, I compiled logs of what had been done in the interim, and I announced her position on social media. I felt as ready as I could be. And to be honest, when she walked in that first morning, I think I was truly excited. But I was also jealous and apprehensive, because you can be more than one thing at a time.
So in those first days and weeks, I would never have guessed that Joanna was struggling with the role or with me. I truly felt welcome to the team. And I suspected then, as I know now for sure, that 99% of that was directly because of Joanna's efforts. I remember thinking to myself, what grace she has to do all this work to bring on her new boss. And that, especially after being on a hunt for the right job for what felt like forever, that was such a gift to feel welcome, to feel like there was a space for me and Prosperous. In fact, I'll always remember the first day that I reported to work. I was sitting nervously in the reception area, and Joanna approached me, and as I stood up to shake her hand, she opened her arms and says, "You can give me a hug." And I'll always remember that hug. And really, it's just an example of so many moments where Joanna made me feel welcomed, made me feel like I belonged there. And what that did is it allowed us to build trust that we needed to then deal with the stuff that we encountered later. And as Joanna and I reflect, we realize that welcoming people into the spaces you occupy is the first step to inclusion. But the feeling of welcoming, the hugs, and the harmony didn't last forever. I experienced some pretty real moments of tension with the team, especially in our team meetings. The tone, the demeanor that I was met with made me feel like the team wasn't excited about my ideas or really about working with me. I experienced the lack of engagement, criticism, and some moments of overt disrespect. It was hard. Overall, I felt excluded from what was a very close-knit team. And that was particularly tough for me because I thought I was paying so much attention to being a good leader, the type of leader that people could respect, and I just wasn't seeming to get anywhere with that. And then there was this acute awareness of race. Here I was, a Black leader with entrepreneurship experience, wanting so badly to be successful in serving mostly Black entrepreneurs in Detroit, and I was experiencing gatekeeping from my white colleagues. I was hurt, I was sad, and the experience affected my mental health. But at the same time, I was getting some great feedback from my boss, from the other directors in the organization, from funders, from stakeholders who have been with Prosperous since the beginning. So I had a suspicion that I didn't just suck at my job. And I also saw how the team was engaging with our entrepreneurs. Again, entrepreneurs of color, engaging them with respect, and enthusiasm. And so I knew like they're just not like mean, awful people. Something more is going on here. So those things combined with my commitment to this work and our community, I just knew that I had to keep going.
Yeah, so I had this story that I was telling myself that because of Chanell's relative position of power, I just had this expectation that that would protect her from feelings of isolation and exclusion. Obviously, that was super wrong. And I held on to things we did before Chanell got there because they gave me a sense of security and a sense of my own power. You know, I got to be in charge if we were doing what we did before she got there. And so small things that she would do to change things, like even the structure of those team meetings, felt so heavy to me. Because in the time that I ran the team, I had curated these team meetings to be what worked for us before she got there. But that didn't work for her style of leadership, and she wanted to make a change, which she had every right to do. And it may seem petty, but it was a painful moment for me, and I didn't know how to share those things with her yet. But what we did realize was that we were both hurting each other. And since we were both versions of a leader on this team, we were also hurting the work that we were doing and all the people we claimed to care about. So both of us, separately but seemingly simultaneously, realized we needed to get our shit together. We had a choice. We could work around the tension present in our relationship and in our work, or we could work through those tensions. And Chanell bravely created space for us to talk through some of those tensions. We had hard, tearful conversations that were full of vulnerability. And in those moments, we got closer and closer to understanding. And I say moments because it wasn't a one and done kind of thing.
Exactly. So being vulnerable with each other meant leaning into our tension. And I know this is going to sound really revolutionary, but dealing with tension means talking about it. But before I could talk to Joanna, I had to deal with a couple of things myself. First, every morning I had to wrestle my ego to the floor because I was tempted to just be frustrated and to categorize people as difficult. So once I did some of that, I also made space for thinking about my own privilege. And again, there was relative privilege within the hierarchy of our situation. And by doing those things, I allowed myself to kind of put my own feelings aside and to think about and ask myself what this experience could feel like from Joanna's perspective. So with that, I approached Joanna, and again, this was a conversation that evolved over time, but I approached with curiosity. And I'd say that we both did a pretty good job of not listening to respond, but instead listening for understanding and working through the difficult moments so we could figure out what was going on and what would work better in the future. Again, we used this moment to then make better choices. For me, that better choice was around creating more space so that Joanna continued to feel empowered as the leader that she was on the team. It also meant that I was able to have a collaborator rather than an adversary or someone that I just had to manage. So again, as we reflect on what we would say to a group of people about this topic, we realize that real inclusion causes tension. That's just part of the process. But how you choose to deal with it, that's what makes it radical.
So, as we all know, we carry biases around us almost like a comfort blanket. And it was really time for me to drop my comfort blanket. And I knew I wasn't doing enough of my own work. Having a job in social justice is not the work. The sickness of white supremacy permeates all aspects of our collective lives. I had to get real honest with myself and confront the idea that just because I respected folks of color, I worked on programs that served folks of color, I had friends, family, and coworkers of color, that didn't mean I was doing anti-racism work. I had to intentionally and in community with other white people that were doing the same kind of thinking, I had to take a hard look at my biases and my privilege and how it was showing up in my job. I had to be radically honest with myself, and I had to stop letting myself off the hook because I was a seemingly good person. The ways that white supremacy shows up in our lives is not about being good or bad. It's about being complicit in a system that values individualism, meritocracy, and whiteness. So I sought out resources that could help me face these things and not drain the labor of Chanell and my other generous friends of color who were like in this with me. So I found an organization that's local in Detroit called Mothering Justice, and it's created by a Black woman, and they launched a program called White Women's School. And the organization, yeah, sorry, it is a funny name. It's a real part of my life now, so I forget how funny it is to say out loud.
Everybody goes to White Women's School, right?
Yeah. So the organization as a whole is really a policy organization, and they work mostly with Black mothers to help them influence policy on behalf of themselves and their families. But they created this program, White Women's School, specifically to help white women figure out how to show up in spaces led by people of color, especially other women.
So if you guys haven't figured it out yet, we did a lot of work in this process, both Joanna and myself. You just can't let yourself off the hook and think that, like these common Hollywood narratives around race reconciliation, that it's going to be easy, right? There's this common story. You see it in The Help, The Green Book, Driving Miss Daisy. I don't know if anyone's watching Driving Miss Daisy, but if you are, that's not real. The point here is that coexistence is not inclusion, right? This effort for true radical inclusion takes effort and time. And in the process of facing, well, what Joanna and I learned is that in the process of facing each other, we were really facing ourselves.
We have to go to the next one, sorry. Yeah. So for me, what I realized was that it's the job of white folks to gather our own and do the work. So no matter the biases, we've taken a lifetime to internalize them, and we're going to need to take the rest of this time to do the unlearning. But that's the work. Especially as a white person working in social impact, the urgency of this unlearning is palpable. We're in a position to do a great deal more harm if we don't make an intentional shift. So I've made a commitment to immerse myself fully in this process, and I'm lovingly opening my heart to others willing to do the same.
So the resolution to our story is that there is no resolution. I think really the only thing we really know is that we have a shared commitment to creating inclusive communities and a shared interest in helping each other grow in our process and being more inclusive. So with that, we ask you guys to join us to be radically inclusive, and we think that if you do, we are going to make a big difference in making this world a more radically inclusive place. Thank you.